Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. I know it's the middle of summer, and so that can be um, a little harder to get folks here. Hi, Jeanette. Good to see you. My name is Dr. Erin Doran. I am a professor at Iowa State University. I also do some consulting work with Catch Next as the Director of Research and Evaluation. One of my areas of expertise is Hispanic Serving Institutions, or HSIs, and just considering that all of our participating colleges identify as HSIs, I think one of the things that I wanted to be able to highlight was some of the basics or a primer on HSIs, what they are, what some of the current research is on them, but then also trying to think about HSIs that are community colleges and how those two identities exist, coexist, or how they even mesh. And so if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat along the way, and I look forward to having some fruitful discussions at the end of this. But HSIs are essentially a type of minority serving institution. Others that you may have heard of include HBCUs, or the historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, or TCUs. There's sort of a new emerging one known as ANAPESIs, which are Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving communities, and HSIs. The big four that are here are the ones that actually have federal designations to them. But the map here, which I understand might be a little bit hard to read, it's a little fuzzy. This is one that I found online that includes a couple of other different types of MSIs that don't have the same sort of federal funding or federal designation attached to them. But there's Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian serving institutions, and there's also predominantly Black institutions. With these, the sort of geography of them, the HSIs that are featured are the green dots. And so you can see that there is a certain amount of concentration in the Southwest in particular, going up through Colorado and certainly through all parts of Texas, and then up in New York, and then down in Florida. I don't think that this, the best I could tell, that this map was probably written about 5 years ago. There are more HSIs now. There are about 559, but you can see some of the geographical concentrations for them. ANAPESIs tend to be on the West Coast, where a lot of our Asian and Asian American populations are concentrated. Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian are very specific to Alaska and Hawaii. And then HBCUs tend to be concentrated through the South, basically the South that was created before the Civil War, or I should say the United States that existed before the Civil War in particular. And so that is just a quick snapshot of these. I think one of the biggest distinctions that's usually made about Hispanic serving institutions versus tribal colleges and universities, as well as HBCUs, is the fact that HBCUs and tribal colleges were distinctly created to serve those institutions. Historically Black colleges, many of whom were established while segregation was still, formal legalized segregation was very much baked into the fabric of American politics, society, culture, etc. Tribal colleges, you can see many of which are concentrated like in the plains and sort of northwest part of the United States. Many of these colleges exist on tribal lands and are run by tribal communities themselves. And so HSIs, I will give you a brief primer on the history of them very quickly. But the thing about HSIs is a lot of these were predominantly white institutions that saw their Latinx population, their enrollment increase, and essentially were able to hit this threshold that is required or stated by the Department of Education. Whoops, wrong way. Here we go. Okay, so as as far as the historical development goes, I mean, part of this that I don't have on the slide is that with the development of the civil rights movement, the passage of federal financial aid policies, et cetera, in the 1960s, you saw an uptick in the number of Latinx students who were able to go to college, as well as those who were running for public office and were able to enter politics, especially at the federal level. And so throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, there was a growth in the number of Latinx identified congressmen who were starting to advocate and lobby on behalf of Latinx higher education and Latinx issues within education. In the 1980s, there was a group of about 18, I believe was the number of original members who formed a coalition of colleges and universities that became known as the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. This is an organization that still exists that has offices in San Antonio and in Washington, D.C. The actual designation Hispanic Serving Institution was created with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in 1992. And so the original definition said that these colleges and universities were nonprofit, which is significant considering proprietary institutions cannot be designated HSIs, but they're not-for-profit institutions that have an undergraduate population that is at least 25% Latinx identified. And then in 1998, that definition was further refined to include that of those 25% or more of Latinx students, at least 50% of them have to identify as low income or Pell Grant eligible or whatever definition is used. In the 2000s, the scholarly interest in studying HSIs started. I think Berta Virge-Leyden was really a pioneer in this. You also had other folks like Margarita Benitez who were writing about this. In 2004, Excelencia in Education, which is a policy think tank that is based in Washington, D.C., was formed, and they have done some of the best work on tracking the number of HSIs over time. If you are not familiar with Excelencia in Education, I strongly recommend that you check out their website. They do some extremely good work on, again, tracking the number of HSIs. They have also looked at the so-called emerging HSIs, which are institutions with 15 to 24.9% Latinx student bodies. And so they are able to sort of track what the future numbers might be, and which universities and colleges, where these HSIs may pop up next. What is significant about the last HSI report that they put out, which was for I believe the 2020-2021 school year, so last academic year, is that for the first time ever, the number of HSIs actually declined. In 2019-2020, there had been 569 HSIs, and likely because of COVID, it dropped 10. So there's now 559. And these are institutions that are across the United States as well as Puerto Rico. They collectively enroll about 66% of all Latinx students enrolled in higher education. They constitute just shy of 20% of all institutions of higher education in the United States. And one thing that is significant is 40% of HSIs are public two-year colleges. So it used to be that there were more community colleges in that were designated HSIs than four-year institutions. Over about the last 10 years, those numbers started to change a little bit more. So as I describe it, public two-year colleges are the plurality, but they're no longer the majority. The other thing that I will say that's really interesting, and in conversations that I've had with folks, is if you look at the emerging HSI list, when you look at places where Latinx population demographics are starting to increase, It tends to be community colleges that reach HSI status first before four-year institutions. So for example, in Iowa, where I live, I believe there are 2 or 3 emerging HSIs. One might be a public seminary institution or a theological institution, if I'm not mistaken. The other 2 are community colleges. They're Marshalltown Community College and Western Iowa Technical College. And so that is something that is worth pointing out. HSIs, the first HSIs tend to be the community colleges in new states, not four-year institutions. And why is it notable to be an HSI? Well, first of all, what's interesting and something that I can talk about in more detail as we get further into it is that some colleges do or may incorporate their HSI designation into their official mission statements. What's really interesting is there is a community college in Arkansas that is an HSI, and I think a relatively recent HSI. And when you go to their homepage, their HSI status is front and center as clearly a recruitment tool. It was something that was written into their diversity plan and their strategic plan to grow the number of Latinx students that were enrolled in their college. There are some institutions that fly the HSI flag very, very proudly. And there are others that you might not know that it's an HSI unless you happen to be combing through the Excellencia in Education list. And so how that identity is perceived by the institution or is advertised by the institution can vary very, very widely. You know, perhaps more pragmatically, why institutions will recruit Latinx students to get over that 25% threshold, pragmatically speaking, and also I think in some ways kind of cynically speaking, being a federally designated HSI does enable institutions to become eligible for pockets of money. And so the Department of Education offers 2 different programs. There are Title V Developing HSI grants, and then there's also POA, which is a Promoting Post-Baccalaureate Opportunities for Hispanic Americans. The POA is overwhelmingly 2 four-year institutions, since it's very much about growing the pipeline for Latinx students who are pursuing graduate programs, you know, master's or doctoral programs or professional programs. So Title V is probably the funding sources that community colleges are most familiar with. And then there have also been, in about the last 10 years, different other funding mechanisms, such as the National Science Foundation has created grants that are specifically for HSIs or for faculty at HSIs. The same thing for the National Endowment for Humanities. So something that I have found interesting about HSIs, you have 559 colleges and universities across 29 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Notably, Puerto Rico, every institution there is an HSI with 100% Latinx student bodies. And that's probably not surprising given where it is. But when we talk about HSI, should we talk about them as a monolithic group of institutions? And there has been research in definitely the last 5 to 7 years that has been focused on trying to better refine what HSIs are, what sort of subgroups within HSIs are. And so, for example, Nunez and her colleagues had published an article in the Journal of Higher Education that offers these 6 typologies of HSIs. And so there are 2 that are specific to community colleges. So urban enclave community colleges, which are going to be your big city institutions. So East LA College and like the LA Community College system, Houston Community Colleges, Alamo Community Colleges, Austin, Dallas College. And then more rural dispersed community colleges, maybe like Doña Ana County Community College in New Mexico, or the ones that are in the Panhandle, or outside of the big metropolitan areas in Texas, certainly. I will admit, I did not look up in IPEDS whether or not South Texas College is considered a rural, or it might be considered more of a suburban or micropolitan institution. But you have these urban enclave and rural dispersed community colleges. You also have big system four-year institutions. I think of, for example, UT San Antonio, the University of Arizona. Arizona State was recently named an HSI. Small community four-year institutions, which I think could be more along the lines of, goodness gracious, I don't think Texas Tech would be considered one, even though it isn't a small community. I think that's more of a big system. But some of the more smaller communities, regional comprehensive institutions, maybe not your big state institution schools. Health science schools, so UT Health Science Center and its various campuses throughout Texas are good, good example of that. And then Puerto Rican institutions. So what does it mean to be serving? I did allude to this already, but to say that unlike HBCUs and tribal colleges and universities, the vast majority of HSIs were not specifically created to serve Latinx students. And so there have been some that have been intentionally created. So Boricua College in New York is normally pointed to as one of those. There is a private, predominantly associate's degree granting institution whose name eludes me that is in Illinois, that has talked about itself as the first truly bilingual institution. At one point, there was an institution called National Hispanic University, which has since closed its doors. It closed its doors about 2014, I believe. But most of these are predominantly white institutions that have become HSIs. And so to the last point about the designation being more focused on inputs or enrollment numbers rather than outputs like graduation rates, I think is a fair point. For a long time, HSIs have been criticized for having lower graduation rates. This is something that Hispanic serving community colleges, I think, are often criticized for having lower graduation rates, or for students who take longer than the normal time to degree. So 3 years for an associate's degree, or 6 years for a bachelor's degree. But one sort of matrix that has been offered within the research is this from Gina Garcia's work. I will tell you, I think that Gina Garcia is probably the most fantastic, rigorous expert on Hispanic serving institutions. She's at the University of Pittsburgh. She has written several books or edited several books on HSIs. So this one that I feature here, Becoming Hispanic Serving Institutions, is excellent. If you are faculty, staff, administrator, researcher, have anything to do with HSIs, I strongly recommend you read Gina's work. It is fantastic. But this matrix that I have here on organizational outcomes is from one of her articles, where she talks about sort of outcomes and then cultural features. And, a Latinx enrolling institution might be one that has a lot of Latinx students, but it's merely enrolling them. It's maybe not investing in interventions or investing in success, in success initiatives that actually move it to producing. So even though HSIs play a significant role in providing access, an important thing that we know about the Latinx educational pipeline is that students actually finish with some sort of degree or credential, whether or not that be for workforce or so that they can go to graduate school or whatever. Attainment is just as important as access to, or enrollment, I should say. And then On the organizational cultural side, she talks about Latinx enhancing versus actually serving. So Latinx enhancing might just be some of the day-to-day sort of checking the box, somewhat performative practices that institutions do or offer to be able to say, yes, we offer a Spanish program. We offer a couple of ethnic studies programs or things, or a couple of, Chicano studies classes or things like that. And I think the easiest way to talk about Latinx serving is in the ways that institutions really put their money where their mouth is, the ways that they move past those performative or symbolic gestures towards specific populations, and really invest in programs, or really shine a light on the success of Latinx students in particular. And one criticism that is often leveraged at HSIs is the fact that Title V funds don't actually have mechanisms toward accountability. And to put that another way, institutions aren't necessarily held to account for the specific ways that these funds benefit Latinx students directly. And so some of the more informal work that I've done on looking at Title V abstracts and seeing what sort of programs or projects were funded under Title V. A college, for example, might say, we want to build a first generation college students center or a learning communities program or something like that. And Latinx students will benefit from this because they will use it. There's a critical mass of students on this population who will likely use these services. But there's nothing to actually look at how enrollment rates or attainment rates were truly moved by these interventions or things like that. So colleges and universities might use these funding streams to fund programs that benefit the broader community, of which Latinx students might be beneficiaries of it kind of by proxy rather than by focus. And Gina has asked these critical questions around whether HSI can constitute a sort of organizational culture and what that looks like. And so again, I am a huge fan of her work. I strongly recommend that you look at her, and the just breadth of her work, which is really something that I admire. And so to get at this concept of servingness, Gina Garcia, Anne-Marie Nunez, and Vanessa Sansone took this systematic review of the literature on servingness to come up with what they called the multidimensional model for servingness for Hispanic serving institutions. And so I think, as you can see, there's a lot of different moving parts to it. They do talk about how all HSIs sort of are operating within a context of white supremacy. And I think that's really tends to be an acknowledgement of operating within an educational system, the historical roots of which were created to serve, to enroll, graduate, et cetera, white folks, not necessarily the education of Latinx students or of racially minoritized populations writ large. And so with this, you have these external influences, which can be federal legislation, policy, local, which for community colleges, we know that local legislative and state legislative policies are probably the ones that can certainly make the biggest difference on a day-to-day basis. Same with the institutional governing boards, et cetera. And then within these structures, it's certainly a question about how does servingness manifest itself? Can a college or university talk about its HSI status or its servingness toward Latinx students in its mission and value statements, in its diversity plans? when it writes these HSI grants, you know, how does it build in accountability measures to ensure that there is direct benefit to Latinx students? In what ways is engagement with the Latinx community documented? I think, you know, something that I have seen at the four-year institution level is in what ways are professors who are on the tenure track awarded, or to what extent is it taken into account in promotion and tenure processes? Faculty members' abilities to do community engaged research and community engaged work. And then what does that look like even in tenure and promotion structures at the community college level? What does community service look like, particularly with Latinx students? Compositional diversity, I'm going to hold on and talk about this on the next one. But you know, there's so many things that can be captured within this. I think something certainly with leadership and decision-making processes can also be the ways that foundations at institutions work, and maybe the ways they can help Latinx students on an institutional level. An example of that I'm thinking of is being in Iowa, we are not a state with a DREAM Act. And so undocumented students who are probably more likely to be Latinx than anything else are not eligible for in-state tuition. They're not eligible for any sort of state or federal financial aid. And so in what ways are community college foundations able to take away barriers for undocumented students? Things like mandatory FAFSA completion, or some sort of verification of citizenship, or things like that, so that they can create funding mechanisms so that undocumented students can be eligible for some sort of support, even when the more common mechanisms for providing financial aid support are cut off because of documentation and things like that. So there are a lot of these, I think that even though they're put into these neat little boxes, it is, I think, understood, at least within the writing of this particular article, that these things can be very overlapping. And this whole thing is much fuzzier than the way it is very tightly organized. This is also a fantastic article. I strongly recommend it. I can share it in the chat when we get to question and answer, and I can see the chat function. Whoops. So something here, oh, I apologize. The figure did not show up for this on this particular thing, but looking at Hispanic serving institutions in particular that are community colleges, I think that similar to a lot of the research that's done in higher education, there is this huge tendency on the part of researchers to focus on four-year institutions and not community colleges. And so there has been a body of research that has been produced over the last 20 years that does take into account HSI designation and two-year college identities or place institutions, but don't think that there's been enough work to really look at the work of Hispanic serving community colleges and what makes them unique and distinct from four-year institutions. If you're following the typology that I showed a couple of slides ago, there's also two types. There's the urban enclave community colleges. There's also the rural dispersed. But just some sort of general questions that I have and that I'm currently contending with as a researcher and as a scholar is one, is it required or is it pragmatic for HSIs that are community colleges to have formal mission statements? And I think one thing that is different about community colleges and four-year institutions is just the broad range of missions that community colleges are simultaneously trying to achieve. They are the place and the institutions that provide community education, adult and basic education, career and technical education, as well as the transfer function for four-year institutions. And so what does it mean, especially for an institution that is trying to be open access and democratic and to serve everyone who walks through their doors, if HSIs put up on their mission statement or signpost to anybody who is there that they are a Hispanic serving institution. The other thing that is also interesting is up until about 10 years ago, St. Philip's College, which is one of the Alamo colleges, was the only institution in the country that was a federally designated HBCU and an HSI. Since then, more and more HBCUs have actually become HSIs. There's some fascinating literature that has been done on these sort of dual mission, dual MSIs that has been done, like by Taryn Ozuna Allen, for example, who's at Texas Christian University. And so it's really messy to start thinking about philosophically if HSI status is an identity, is it a mission? Like, what does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis for community colleges? I think that something that is super important to think about is the compositional diversity among faculty, staff, and administrators at community colleges. Nicholas Vargas has done some great work at talking about how many HSIs remain predominantly white institutions, especially if you are looking at the faculty, staff, and administrators. So in the subgroup of HSIs that he looked at in his sample, for instance, the average demographic, this is a messy way to put it. The student body, the average student body of all of the community colleges in his sample tended to be about 40% Latinx, but Latinx faculty, staff, and administrators were only about 18% on this in the same campuses or the same pool of community colleges. And so something that is important to think about with that is just that there tends to be a mismatch between the compositional diversity of the faculty, staff, and administrators who are working with community college students and then the community college students themselves. Something that I will say though, is that Brent Shada, who just retired from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the community college leadership program there, and he's a long established community college scholar. He had published some of the early work on HSIs that are community colleges while he was at Texas Tech, and some of this work is about 20 years old now. But one of the things that he found that I think is really important is that for Latinx community college students, one of the things that is important is not just if the faculty, staff, or administrator that they're working with identifies as Latinx themselves, it's to what extent said faculty, staff, and administrator demonstrates cultural competence and caring toward Latinx students. And so while compositional diversity is important, if you have non-Latinx folks who are working on these HSI campuses, it's also just important that they show cultural competence, cultural humility, radical empathy and care for these students that they serve. And then in thinking about how serving manifests itself in the classroom or in the community, in the broader campus community and all that, I think that it is worth it to talk about the programs that are available on campus, the curriculum. Are there Mexican American Studies classes available to students? Are there classes that support the success of students? So are there robust developmental education program offerings to support students wherever they are? Are there robust and holistic support services that are available to prepare students for whatever their academic journey is? Something that I had put in this figure that is not showing up on the screen is some emerging trends or things that I think are critically understudied in the context of HSIs that are community colleges. One of them is career and technical education. It's actually shocking how little research there is on Latinx students in CTE programs. There is one study that I found that is, I think, at least 15 years old at this point, but one of the things that the authors found is that Latinx students were most likely to be in the lowest paying CTE field. So they're getting degrees and certificates that tended to pay the lowest. Again, that data might look very different if it was done in 2022. It was about 15 years when I read it. But there hasn't been a whole lot that has looked at what CTE programs at Hispanic serving community colleges are doing in service to Latinx students. I think understanding how we bring students back to campus following the last 2 years of the pandemic, financial aid concerns are particularly important to Latinx students. There isn't necessarily a whole lot of research on Latinx community college students. I would refer you to my colleague and friend, Vincent Garales, who is a professor at the University of Houston, who looks at these issues. But there is a lot to say that when either federal, state, or local programs, and this can be anything from TRIO, Educational Talent Search, McNair Scholars Programs, and things like that, when those get contracted, then those serve as important access points for students in post-secondary ed. So when those get contracted, that can have negative impacts on Latinx students. Trying to think what else is on that figure. I will get a better copy of that so you can see what's on that figure and what I argue are some of the emerging issues. I will stop talking so that we can have a question and answer. The full work that I'm doing in this area, part of it will be published hopefully early 2023 in the Community College Review, and that'll be something that I will make sure that gets shared out through this network. And I know I promised that I would put some various things in the chat, but while I'm doing that, I wanted to go ahead and open it up for Q&A and to see what questions y'all might have.
I have so many, I don't know where to start.
Okay.
This is great. I really enjoyed hearing, all of the things that you've studied and sharing it with us. And I teach at San Antonio College, and yeah, I see a lot of these things that you're talking about. And I did have a question. You were talking about emerging issues, and I'm really interested in knowing, just knowing more about that. Could you tell me more about, like you said, that Latinx and community colleges have not been well studied? Could you give like a little more detail into like what part of that? I mean, there is a lot of research out there, but I don't like what still needs to be researched, what's still lacking, what needs, what studies need to be duplicated, like what, yeah, like a little more on that would be great.
Sure. So I think that I put in the PDF that I put in the chat, you can see the figure that was actually missing from that last slide. So one of them, like I said, is certainly career technical education. I think something that hasn't necessarily been looked at as widely as four-year institutions is the concept of campus racial climate on community colleges. So essentially, this is work that was really started by Sylvia Hurtado back in the late 1990s. I think that her student, who is now an associate professor at UC Davis, Marcela Cuellar, has done some good work on this, but I think it can still be extended. So one of the things that Marcela looked at was a Hispanic serving community college in California, and was just looking at the ways that Latinx and other minoritized students, how they perceived the sense of welcoming, the sense of either how welcoming or how hostile the campus climate could be to students of color. And there's a lot of, like, Sylvia Hurtado has done a great model for what a campus racial climate looks like. So it can be things like how it connects to local communities, compositional diversity of faculty and staff, its curriculum, the ways that the quality of interactions between faculty and students, et cetera. So there's a lot of different things that can go into it. It's very multidimensional, very multi-layered. But one of the things that Cuellar and her colleague found was that a critical mass of Latinx students does not necessarily mean that there's no racism on campus, or that students are not having racist interactions. And in fact, I think she found that on this campus, it was Latinx and Asian American students who were most likely to experience some sort of racism on that campus. So I think that understanding racism on community college campuses and in the context of HSIs, that we shouldn't make assumptions that a plurality of racially minoritized students equates to no racism. And I think that in the last 3 or 4 years, there's also been a huge explosion within Latinx scholars of trying to document and to figure out ways that we can really contend with anti-Blackness in the Latinx community, anti-indigeneity in the Latinx community, and just what those critical issues are. I think looking at more intersectional identities, so not just focusing on race, ethnicity, and then I think we also look at gender, but there have been a couple of up and coming scholars, in particular. I'm thinking of Angel Gonzalez and Yolanda Cataño, who are doing work on queer Latinx students in Hispanic community colleges, and the ways that community colleges that identify at HSIs can support not just students from a racial ethnic perspective, but to also to be able to support their queer identities as well. I think something else that we don't maybe talk enough about, that I see as an emerging area for understanding and better serving students, is how do we also try to mitigate or end community college stigma. We know that Latinx students are far more likely to come to the community college and to start their education journeys there. So in what ways do we prepare them for snarky remarks they might get for being community college students, even once they go to, say, UT San Antonio or Texas A&M University San Antonio? Might there be snarky comments that are made to them or looks that are made to them for being community college transfer students? How do we really start to boost a sense of pride of being community college, to being community college graduates or students who started there? So I think being able to see that, the way that colleges really try to promote that sense of pride would be great.
Thank you. I did want to ask you one more question.
Of course.
So do you think, what are your thoughts on, so I know that at San Antonio College, we have a lot of like internal motivators. We have a lot of things in place for our students to kind of anchor them to the campus. clubs and activities, advocacy center, empowerment center, Ascender, right? CTN, we have that there. When I when I look in my own classroom, what I am seeing a gap in, and what the literature also says is, points to, is that it's our Hispanic males that are not persisting as well as our Hispanic females or our Latinas. And I'm wondering how we can grab, but what we can do to intervene in a bigger way for that student. And is there like any external motivators that, do you know of any research or studies, or who are the, who's doing work in this area, looking at like things outside of college that motivate, our Hispanic males to not only, enroll, but to persist, right? To not only to a 2-year degree, but persist to a 4-year degree. Mm-hmm. That's really the goal when they come in, a lot of them, that is their goal, is to get a 4-year degree. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, or if you knew what the,
yeah, there's
the buzzes or
there's a lot of research on that. So if you were unfamiliar with it, I would say a great first step would be to look up Project Males out of UT Austin. So this is a research program that was started by Victor Saenz and Luis Panwan. Victor Saenz is at UT Austin. Luis Panwan is at Texas A&M College Station. They have created like a whole scholar network of researchers, many of whom focus on men of color. And Latinx men, Latino males in particular. And so off the top of my head, I would say looking at Sarah Rodriguez's work, Cristobal Salinas, who's at Florida Atlantic University, Daryl Hatch Tokamaiza, who's at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. There's also another men of color set of researchers who are at San Diego State University. So this is J. Luke Wood and Frank mm-hmm. Harris, mm-hmm. as well as Marisa Vasquez, who have done excellent work that are specifically focused on the success initiatives of men of color at community colleges in particular. I think for what little I have studied men of color in particular and Latino males, like there is one article that I co-wrote with Sarah Rodriguez, so one of our graduate students when she was at Iowa State. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we found is that it seemed like one of the things that was really hurting Latino males who transferred to 4-year institutions was their sense of transfer shock. So they, community colleges are fantastic in the ways that there tend to be lower class sizes, more hands-on advising and mentoring and things like that. And so some of the men who were included in that study, like what we found was they would get to the 4-year institution and everything was different. Everything was bigger. They didn't know who to talk to. Or the fear of the size of the institution and of losing that day-to-day, like intimate contact with an advisor or a faculty member or things like that, kept them from wanting to transfer in the first place and maybe stopping out rather than persisting. And so I think sort of hand in hand with the ending community college stigma is in also just thinking about the ways that we prepare students for that transfer process, not just in making sure that we maximize the number of credit hours that will transfer to the university, but in how we prepare them for that transfer shock, for that culture shock that they might have once they make that leap to the 4-year institution.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anybody else who has a question? And I'm going to put a couple of things in the chat. So the first one is the article that talks about the multidimensional model for servingness. That is by Gina Garcia and Anne Marie Nunez, as well as Vanessa Sansone. Vanessa Sansone is local to some of y'all. She's at UTSA. The second one is just one of Gina's articles. Hopefully you should be able to access this. The second one is where I got that matrix that I presented on enrollment versus or outcomes and organizational culture and moving toward Latinx serving institutions. If you're interested in decolonizing practices, Gina has written about decolonizing practices at HSIs, which is really important work as well. Any other questions?
Erin, would you mind just putting your contact information in the chat?
Of course.
You gave me a lot of good names today. I wrote some of them down, but I wasn't able to capture all of them.
No worries.
So I may reach out to you.
No, please do. Please feel free to. And if for some reason any of the links are inaccessible, let me know. I can always send you a PDF copy of them. I may have access to things that are behind the paywall with a little bit more ease. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, we're at 5 to the hour. So thank you very much for attending. It was great to have this conversation with y'all. And I hope it was helpful for you. If you would like to continue the conversation, my email address is right there. And I look forward to it. But thank you for attending. And it was good to see y'all.
Thank you.